Every summer, millions of air conditioners quietly perform what feels like a magic trick. You close the windows, you shut the door. The sun is beating down outside. The driveway is hot enough to fry an egg if you're willing to sacrifice a perfectly good breakfast. And somehow, 20 minutes later, your living room feels like an entirely different season. It's one of those everyday conveniences we almost stop noticing. You press a button, cold air comes out, end of story. Except that's not actually what's happening. Your air conditioner has never created cold, not once. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? After all, cold air is pouring out of the vents. If it isn't making cold, then what exactly has that noisy metal box been doing all these years? The answer turns out to be much more interesting than simply making air cold. In fact, once you understand how air conditioning works, you'll also understand why your refrigerator works, why your car has air conditioning, why your outdoor unit feels hot even on the hottest day of the year, and why the name air conditioning isn't really about cooling at all. So today, we're going to answer two questions. Why do we call it air conditioning, and how does it actually work? The story begins with something we almost never think about. What is cold? If I handed you two metal cups, one filled with boiling water and the other packed with ice, you'd probably tell me one contains heat and the other contains cold. That's how most of us naturally think about it. Physics has a slightly different opinion. Heat is real. It's energy. We can measure it, track where it goes, and watch it move from one place to another. Cold isn't really a thing by itself. It's simply what we call a place that contains less heat. A good way to picture it is with light. Darkness isn't something you can pour into a room. You don't buy darkness at the hardware store. Darkness is simply what remains when light is removed. Cold works the same way. When you walk into an air-conditioned room, the machine hasn't filled the room with cold, it's taken heat away. That sounds like a tiny difference, but it isn't. Because once you stop asking how an air conditioner makes cold, you start asking a much better question: where did the heat go? Take a look around the room you're sitting in. Your television is producing heat. Your computer is producing heat. Your phone is producing heat. The lights above your head are producing heat. Even you are producing heat. Every second you're alive, your body is generating warmth just by keeping you alive. Then, sunlight pours through the windows all afternoon, warming the furniture, the floor, and the walls. Before long, your entire house has become a giant collection of trapped heat. That energy can't simply disappear. One of the most fundamental ideas in physics is that energy doesn't vanish, it has to go somewhere. So, if your living room gets cooler, something has to carry that heat away. That's the real job of an air conditioner, not making cold, moving heat. And the star of that entire process is something you've probably heard of, but almost never think about: refrigerant. At first glance, refrigerant seems almost disappointingly ordinary. It's just chemical flowing through copper tubes. You can't see it, you rarely hear it. Most homeowners would walk right past it every day without giving it a second thought. But refrigerant has one remarkable talent. It changes between a liquid and a gas incredibly easily under the right conditions. That single ability is what makes modern air conditioning possible. You've actually experienced the same principle yourself. Imagine stepping out of a swimming pool on a warm afternoon. For a moment, everything feels comfortable, then a breeze rolls through. Suddenly, you start shivering. The wind didn't magically become freezing. Instead, the water on your skin began evaporating. Changing from a liquid to a gas requires energy, so the water borrowed some of that energy from your body. It literally carried heat away from your skin. That's why evaporation cools you down. Your air conditioner uses the exact same idea, only instead of water cooling your skin, it uses refrigerant to cool your entire house. The refrigerant begins its journey inside a set of metal coils, hidden somewhere in your home. Depending on your system, they're usually tucked away inside an indoor unit or above the ceiling near your furnace. You almost never see them, but they're doing most of the important work. A fan pulls warm air from your house across these cold coils. At first, that sounds backwards. If the goal is to cool your home, why not just blow cold air into the room? Because the air isn't what matters, the heat is. As the warm indoor air passes over the coils, something remarkable happens inside the refrigerant. It's sitting at just the right pressure that it begins changing from a liquid into a gas. That phase change requires an enormous amount of energy, and the easiest place to get that energy is from the warm air flowing across the coils. So the refrigerant absorbs the heat. The air, now carrying less heat than before, is blown back into your home. That's the cool air you feel coming from your vents. Nothing inside the room became cold, the air simply came back with much of its heat removed. Meanwhile, the refrigerant has quietly collected all of that unwanted energy and carried it away. It's almost like watching a sponge soak up spilled water. The sponge doesn't destroy the water, it simply holds onto it until it's taken somewhere else. Refrigerant behaves in much the same way, except instead of soaking up water, it's soaking up heat. Of course, that creates another mystery. If the refrigerant keeps absorbing heat from your house, why doesn't it eventually become too hot to do its job? Shouldn't it just fill up and stop working? The answer is yes if the cycle stopped there, but it doesn't. The refrigerant is only halfway through its journey. Once it has absorbed heat from inside your house, it travels through copper tubing to the large unit sitting outdoors. This is where most people think the air conditioner starts working. In reality, it's where the air conditioner empties itself so it can begin all over again. Inside that outdoor unit is a component called the compressor, often described as the heart of the entire system. Its job is surprisingly simple. It squeezes the refrigerant. That may not sound very exciting, but if you've ever used a bicycle pump, you've experienced this effect firsthand. Try pumping up a tire for a minute or two, then place your hand on the metal barrel of the pump. You'll notice it feels noticeably warmer than when you started. That isn't friction doing all the work. Compressing a gas naturally raises its temperature. The molecules become crowded together, collide more frequently, and the gas gets hotter. Your air conditioner deliberately takes advantage of that property. The compressor packs the refrigerant into a much smaller space, dramatically increasing both its pressure and its temperature. At this point, the refrigerant is actually much hotter than the summer air outside, and that's exactly what the system wants. Heat always prefers moving from something hotter to something cooler. That's why a hot cup of coffee gradually cools on your kitchen counter. It's why an ice cube melts in a warm drink. And it's why the refrigerant, now hotter than the outside air, begins giving up the heat it collected from your house. A fan blows outdoor air across another set of coils wrapped around the refrigerant. This time, the process runs in reverse. Instead of absorbing heat, the refrigerant releases it. The heat that was sitting in your living room just a few moments ago is now warming the air outside your house. If you've ever stood near an outdoor air conditioning unit in the middle of summer, you've probably noticed the air blowing out of it feels surprisingly warm. That's not wasted energy, that's your living room, or your kitchen, or your bedroom. The machine is literally throwing your indoor heat back outside where it came from. Once the refrigerant has released most of its heat, it isn't finished yet. It's still under very high pressure. Before it can return inside your home, it has to cool down even further. This happens at a tiny component called the expansion valve. Despite its modern size, it's one of the most important parts of the entire system. Think of putting your thumb over the end of a garden hose. Pressure builds behind your thumb because the water suddenly has less room to move. Now imagine taking your thumb away. The water rushes forward, pressure drops, and everything suddenly has more room to expand. The refrigerant experiences something very similar. As it passes through the expansion valve, its pressure drops dramatically. When pressure falls, so does temperature. Within moments, the refrigerant becomes cold enough to absorb even more heat from your home. Then it returns to the indoor coils, ready to repeat the entire process again, over and over and over. Not because it's being replaced, not because it's being used up, but because it's continuously cycling through the exact same loop. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about air conditioners. Under normal conditions, refrigerant isn't fuel. It isn't consumed like gasoline in a car. If your system is sealed and functioning properly, the same refrigerant can circulate for years without needing to be replaced. It simply keeps carrying heat from one place to another. And at this point, we've uncovered the trick. Your air conditioner isn't creating cold. It's running the same cycle over and over again, collecting heat from inside your home, carrying it outside, releasing it, and returning for another trip. Once you see it that way, a lot of little mysteries suddenly make sense. For example, have you ever noticed water dripping from an air conditioner on a hot day? It's easy to assume there's a leak, but most of the time there isn't. Remember those cold evaporator coils inside your house? As warm indoor air passes over them, it's not just giving up heat, it's also giving up moisture. The same thing happens when you pour an ice-cold drink on a humid summer afternoon. Before long, water droplets begin forming on the outside of the glass. The water didn't leak through the glass, it came from the air. Warm air can hold a surprising amount of water vapor. When that air suddenly cools against the evaporator coils, it can no longer hold all of that moisture. The excess water condenses into liquid droplets, collects in a drain pan, and flows safely outside through a drain line. That little puddle beside your house isn't your air conditioner leaking, it's humidity that used to be floating invisibly inside your home. That leads us to another question. If removing heat is enough to cool a room, why doesn't sitting in the shade feel exactly the same as walking into an air-conditioned building? After all, both places are cooler than standing in direct sunlight. The difference is that an air conditioner isn't just lowering the temperature, it's also removing moisture from the air. Humidity has a huge influence on how comfortable we feel. Your body cools itself primarily by sweating. As that sweat evaporates, it carries heat away from your skin. But when the air is already packed with moisture, sweat evaporates much more slowly. That's why an 85-degree day with high humidity can feel much hotter than an 85-degree day in the desert. An air conditioner solves both problems at once. It lowers the temperature and it dries the air. The result is a room that doesn't just measure cooler on a thermometer, it actually feels more comfortable to the people inside it. That brings us back to the name we started with, air conditioning. Not air cooling, air conditioning. There's a reason for that. The phrase was never meant to describe a machine that simply made rooms colder. To condition something means to bring it into a desired state. You can condition leather. You can condition your body through exercise. You can even condition your hair. Early engineers were trying to do something similar with air. They wanted precise control over temperature, humidity, cleanliness, and circulation all at the same time. Cooling was only one part of the job. The goal was to create air with predictable, reliable conditions. In other words, they weren't trying to make cold air, they were trying to make better air. And that idea existed before most homes had air conditioning at all. To understand why, we have to go back to the summer of 1902. A young engineer named Willis Carrier had been given a difficult problem. It wasn't coming from homeowners or office workers or people trying to sleep on hot summer nights. It came from a printing company. Every summer, humidity was causing the paper inside the printing presses to expand and contract. Ink colors that were supposed to line up perfectly kept drifting out of alignment, ruining expensive print jobs. The company didn't ask Carrier to cool the building. They asked him to control the air. Standing on a train platform one foggy morning, Carrier began thinking about the relationship between temperature, moisture, and air. That moment led him to design a system capable of controlling humidity with remarkable precision. It solved the printing problem, but it also did something nobody had fully anticipated. As the humidity dropped, the building became dramatically more comfortable. An invention intended to improve magazines and catalogs would eventually transform offices, movie theaters, hospitals, schools, shopping malls, data centers, and millions of homes around the world. Comfort wasn't the original goal, it was the unexpected bonus. Once air conditioning became practical, cities began changing around it. Office buildings could grow taller because sealed windows were no longer a problem. Movie theaters advertised cool indoor air during scorching summers. Factories became more productive. Hospitals gained far greater control over indoor environments. Eventually, entire regions with long, hot summers experienced rapid population growth because living and working there became far more comfortable than it had been just a few decades earlier. It's remarkable to think that a machine originally built to solve a printing problem reshaped architecture, business, medicine, and even where millions of people chose to live. That's a much bigger story than simply cooling a room. And there's one final connection that I think ties everything together. Your refrigerator, your freezer, your car's air conditioning, many modern heat pumps, and even large supermarket cooling systems. At first glance, they all seem like completely different machines built for completely different purposes. But inside, they're all playing the same game. They collect heat from one place, they move it somewhere else. Then they repeat the cycle. The designs may look different, the components may vary, but the underlying idea is beautifully consistent. Human beings didn't discover a way to manufacture cold. We discovered one of the most effective ways to persuade heat to leave. That's a subtle difference, but once you understand it, it's almost impossible to unsee. The next time you hear that outdoor unit humming on a hot afternoon, you won't think of it as a box that's making cold air. You'll know it's doing something far more interesting. It's quietly carrying yesterday's sunlight, the warmth from your television, the heat from your oven, and even a little of your own body heat, then releasing all of it back into the outside world. That's the real magic of air conditioning. It was never about creating cold. It was always about giving heat somewhere else to go. Stay curious, friends. Thanks for spending a few minutes being curious with me today. If you enjoyed the journey, I'd really appreciate a like, and if you'd like to join me for the next curiosity, I'd love to have you here.